be with you all. So we're going to get into some political theory. How many people have read Wollstonecraft? Okay, how about Rousseau? Oh, good. All right. Little Locke, little Tocqueville, not much Tocqueville, but okay. And we have experts more than I, Rousseau experts more than I in this room, so we may get into a little bit of a tussle here at the end. It's going to be very exciting. Okay, so this afternoon I want to discuss what I take to be a crucially important task of our time, the moral formation of women. As I assume you all know, as good ISI students, our country's founders viewed the Republican regime they crafted as one that depended upon the virtue of its citizens. Though they well appreciated human fallibility and our propensity for vice, and so institutionalized checks and balances to ward off or ward against any vicious faction or individual gaining power over all others, they also knew that political self-government required personal self-government. And a vicious people, a people enslaved by their own passions, would easily be made the slaves of others. For the American founders, then, true freedom required virtue. And virtue was properly inculcated in families and churches, and at that time was understood to be duly supported by both the law and, for these religious people, grace. And the inculcation of virtue was not the work of one generation. It would be required of every generation, and so every family and every citizen. A republic, if you can keep it. With the collapse of Christianity as the common religion and the decline of a view of education that foregrounds religious and moral formation over the last half century at least, none of us should be surprised that our republic is in decline. The question for us is what to do about it. Some on the right, and I suppose the left too, seem to think that human beings really aren't capable of republican self-government. Call me naive, but I think they are wrong. I think the classical school movement in the United States, of which I've been a part, offers me a great deal of hope in this regard, as do my own children and their friends. So let's not, I say, give up on the experiment in ordered liberty quite yet. But we are failing, so there's much work to do. But to have any chance of revitalizing our republic, we must not give in to the current view, which is on the left and increasingly the right, I think, that power politics is the answer to all our woes. Now, don't get me wrong, as a Catholic legal and political theorist, I am a great believer in the need for the state to protect not just individual rights, but to actively promote the common good. So winning political battles is, of course, a key way to fight for a fulsome conception of that good. And I also believe strongly in the power of the law as an educative force for good and for ill. But as St. Thomas Aquinas well taught, human law only moves human beings gradually toward virtue. The most harmful acts can be forbidden and punished, and laws and policy should incline citizens to virtue, but the law can't reach every vicious act. And so the inculcation and cultivation of virtue upon which true republicanism and true republican freedom really depends is chiefly the responsibility of civil society, and most particularly of families, of fathers and mothers. And the responsible agents of our own lives, both men and women, are responsible for their own growth in the virtues, and also that of their children. But as the very first teacher of the child, I want to argue, and I think this is in line with the Christian and kind of American traditions, that the responsibility for the cultivation of virtue in young children falls not exclusively, but most concretely on their mothers, whose attentive presence and affectionate correction young children especially need. It is for this reason that Tocqueville well saw that women shape the mores of societies. And so whatever concerns women, he wrote, is of great consequence to the regime. So what then are we to do when a regime that depends greatly upon virtue in its citizens holds a false conception of women? For in our time, women are not regarded as those specially endowed with a great moral authority and responsibility to teach the young. No, instead, women are too often viewed in our culture as unsexed, interchangeable minions or girl bosses of the all-encompassing market economy, or materialistic and superficial stay-at-home girlfriends, or worst of all, I think, sexual playthings meant for titillation of their internet consumers. And because as a culture we now lack a deep and authentic understanding of the realities of sin and grace, of vice and virtue, of creation, the fall, and redemption, there's a temptation, I think even among Christians, to look around at the feminine viciousness and superficiality we see, that I mentioned on the panel and I'll be discussing more shortly, and call it woman's nature per se. This very same temptation presents itself on the male side because vicious men use their hormone-mediated and very positive inclination for risk-taking and aggression in a domineering and predatory way. Some suggest this is just male nature. All we can do is give it an outlet. Boys will be boys. But this conception of nature is not Christian. It's Hobbesian. Hobbes and the moderns who followed him had a low account of human nature. Indeed, Hobbes's observations of man as naturally, quote, desirous of ease and sensual delight, with a, quote, perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceases only in death, well describes the libido dominandi of fallen nature, or lust for dominion. And remember, Hobbes' solution to man as he is, or fallen man as he is tyrannical government, building laws and fences high enough to guard against ever-desirous man. For such a man or woman can never be self-governing or virtuous. He or she can never be free. But the ancient and Christian conceptions of the human being, those that Hobbes was explicitly, by name, rejecting, offer a much higher account of human nature, and I think a truer account. We human beings are created good, as Genesis tells us, with rational capacities by which we image the divine. And as such, we are naturally inclined to and attracted to virtue, truth, goodness, and beauty. But at the very same time, and this again the founders understood, given weakness, human weakness and fallibility, the concupiscence born of what Christians call the fall, we also have an internal capacity for disorder. And so we have a kind of internal battle raging within. If we don't then work to cultivate, tend to, and direct these natural inclinations, they can become corrupted through vice and sin. And it's not only individuals whose lives can be corrupted, as we know, it's also social mores, institutions, whole societies, regimes. So I think maybe most of us, I at least think that our post-Christian society is such a society that has become morally corrupt. And so it is no surprise that most of us also have a false, flattened, reductionist conception of what it is to be human, and so too what is to be a virtuous woman or a virtuous man. And so I return to the question that seems to me to be the nub of our problem. What are we to do then when our regime is so corrupt that it promotes a false conception of women, those the American founders relied upon in particular to inculcate the virtues needed for Republican self-government? Well, the 18th century philosopher, moralist, and pedagogue Mary Wollstonecraft faced the very same question in her day, which was the same day. And so I'll argue that, yes, despite her own personal failings, her thought on the moral formation of women can provide a path forward for us today. So Wollstonecraft lived and wrote in the late 18th century, just at the time the American and then French revolutions were throwing off old forms of hereditary rule in their respective attempts, with greater and lesser success, to enact altogether new forms of republican government based on God-given rights derived from the moral status of human beings as rational creatures. Like her fellow small r Republicans, Wollstonecraft extolled freedom from illegitimate and arbitrary power, but not freedom as an end in itself. Political freedom both depended upon and was in the service of the moral development of each person, which consisted of virtuously fulfilling the ordinary duties of life. In her view, the trouble with the Republican vision offered by the French revolutionaries, in sharp contrast to the Americans, I might add, was that the French foregrounded liberty, equality, and fraternity without recognizing the true revolution in morals that was needed to ground and support these aspirations. The aristocracy and the clerics and the lower classes that learned from them had grown corrupt, she believed, focused not on the true internal inculcation of virtue that was necessary for political self-government, but instead on riches, property, honors, and the pretentious and artificial forms and manners. As she writes in her critique of Edmund Burke's reliance on tradition to defend the monarchy, quote, "Men were content to borrow their virtues from posterity, rather than undertake the arduous task of acquiring virtue for themselves. Both men and women, she thought, were morally corrupt if in different ways. And this corruption of them both was self-reinforcing. As this conference rightly assumes, only together could men and women find a way out. As Wollstonecraft herself put it, the two sexes mutually corrupt and improve one another. And so she addresses her vindication of the rights of woman in 1792 to the author of a report that called for national public education to form male citizens in the virtues of self-government, and this report had relied in particular on Rousseau's educational theories in his Emile. And so her rights of women is in the main an engagement and critique of Rousseau's theory of women's education. So as one who had not only by then written 3 books on the education of young women, but who had also served as the eldest daughter of her own large family, worked as a governess for another family, and had also opened a school for girls, Wollstonecraft wished to offer her own account of the kind of education women needed for a republic to thrive. But not only for Republican citizenship, for their own flourishing as human beings, and the flourishing of their families, both of which Republican freedom depended upon and promised in her view. And so Wollstonecraft writes early in The Rights of Women that, quote, "The mother who wishes to give true dignity of character to her daughter must proceed on a plan diametrically opposed to that which Rousseau has recommended." So after all this introduction, I finally get to the aim of my talk: to explore Wollstonecraft's account of moral education as a prerequisite for women to live according to their noble dignity. But to understand it fully, and to see how I think it can help us today, I want to draw out Wollstonecraft's views up and against her chief interlocutors, Rousseau primarily, but also John Locke, who Rousseau was engaging. For though Wollstonecraft borrows insights from each, she ultimately offers a very different account of what it is to be a virtuous woman and man from Rousseau, and of what it is to be fully human from Locke. I'll argue that her account of education and moral formation is far more ancient and Christian than either of theirs. And importantly, it's the kind of education that we need today. Whereas Rousseau and Locke sought to educate men and women to be virtuous citizens for the needs of the liberal or Republican polity, Wollstonecraft had her eyes set on heaven, right where I think we need them to be. As Edith Stein taught, but from a deeply Catholic perspective, the first education of women must be religious education, seeing the transcendent purpose of their lives so as to understand who they really are and in what their true dignity and nobility consists. Wollstonecraft was no Catholic, and yet a transcendent vision of education is her account as well. Okay, so with Rousseau, and the American founders too, Wollstonecraft believed that private virtue cultivated in families was necessary to the public virtue needed in a republic. Indeed, they all bemoaned what they took to be the decadence of a society enamored by wealth and titles rather than virtue. The trouble, according to Wollstonecraft, is that even as Rousseau spoke of virtue, he wished to see women lean into what Wollstonecraft regards as the vicious temptations women characteristically have to servile dependency, sensuality, and the desire to please men at all costs. It's not that Rousseau is not insightful about the nature of women and men. Wollstonecraft follows Rousseau in seeing vanity as humanity's primary failing. But Rousseau's education for men attempts to guard against this vanity. His education for women does no such thing. He wishes instead to make use of women's vanity to have them lean into it. or this is my understanding of Wollstonecraft's understanding, and I'm happy to be corrected. And according to Wollstonecraft's reading, Rousseau wants women to do this, to kind of lean into their vanity for the sake of men, or really for the sake of channeling men's passions into manly service of the state. For he seems to think that men will only serve the family as good providers and defenders, as he believes they should be, if they perceive women to be comparatively weak and entirely dependent upon them. That is, only if men idolize women as a kind of foreign, mysterious species will men consecrate themselves to the family and the state's protection. And because women are physically weaker and much more vulnerable when they have children, women really have no alternative, in Rousseau's view, but to achieve a kind of equality in marriage through working to ensure that men also depend upon them. Indeed, in Rousseau's account, women find their strength, their empire, by ruling over and disciplining men's desires through their modesty and feminine charms. Women's gentle submission is a kind of political tool by which women exert quiet control and power, compelling the father of their child to stick around to provide and inspiring men to heroic activity for the good of the state. Rousseau writes, "Unless a man is a monster, the gentleness of a woman will bring him around and triumph over him sooner or later." One hastens to ask, well, what if the man in particular is indeed a monster? Well, we'll come back to that. Now, Wollstonecraft well recognizes that there is a kind of feminine power in a young woman who reigns through a kind of submission to the opinion of men. And Wollstonecraft takes her task to be a difficult one, not only to convince her male readers that rigorous education is crucial for women to be good wives and mothers and good citizens too, but she also has to convince women and mothers of daughters that a life of authentic virtue and true companionship with one's husband, or future husband, is a more noble ambition, one on which their own happiness and the true good of the family and society depends. After all, there are many risks to women who forego their own moral development and focus primarily on kind of feminine charms. And she's in particularly thinking about the upper classes of her time. So women who have been trained up from their youth to focus on kind of their beauty and accomplishments, playing the piano, these kinds of things were outward, what she thought to be outward kind of accomplishments, in order to kind of win the best husband, or you can imagine today kind of the best kind of online fans, right? They're vulnerable to being abandoned by their husband at that time for a younger woman as their beauty wanes, or not having fans anymore as their beauty wanes, or being left a widow with no substantial moral recourses to depend upon because they were so focused on becoming pleasing. Or the women are taught that to reign by their beauty and charms may also be tempted by the attention they receive from other men who aren't their husbands, right? If they're so consumed with external appearances and how they look and all of that, then maybe they won't be so focused on loyalty to their husband, but they'll be interested in how they're pleasing other men instead. So Wollstonecraft laments, quote, "Still the real homage which women receive is intoxicating. It may be impossible to convince them that the illegitimate power which they obtain by degrading themselves into objects of men's desire is a curse. The sensual power that women obtain over men is, she says, by unjust means, because it demands that women practice and foster vice. It's a path in her view that leads women to become either the abject slaves of men or capacious tyrants over them, incapable of what she rather hopes for them, quote, to be more observant daughters, more affectionate sisters, more faithful wives, and more reasonable mothers." And so Wollstonecraft famously writes against Rousseau, quote, "I don't wish women to have power over men, but over themselves." And she wanted such virtuous self-mastery for men too. So Wollstonecraft explains early on in The Rights of Women that if women are not, quote, prepared by education to become the companions of men rather than their mistresses, they will, quote, stop the progress of knowledge and virtue. Why? Because they won't form the good marriages upon which personal happiness and societal happiness depends. And they won't be prepared to inculcate virtue in their own children, having not worked to cultivate virtue in themselves. As she writes, quote, the care of children in their infancy is one of the grand duties annexed to the female character by nature. And because her elevated view of women's work in forming because of her elevated view of mother's work, in forming the character of her children, she knew that motherhood required great strength of body, mind, and soul. But these natural and noble duties of care, nurture, and education were not so strong in her view that they would necessarily overpower corrupt social conventions. Such natural inclinations and duties needed to be cultivated by education, social expectation, and support. In her time, and it seems to me in ours, they were not. As she writes, quote, strength of body and mind are sacrificed to libertine notions of beauty, rendering women but, quote, alluring mistresses or, quote, objects for the moment. The women she charged cared more about sensual pleasures, self-adornment, and preening, and, quote, establishing themselves socially. They cared more about all that than the important work, again, of forming their own characters and those of their children. And this desire of establishing themselves makes, she says, mere animals of them. Again, she laments, can these beings, these morally weak beings, govern a family or take care of the poor babes whom they bring into the world? No, she says, their education in society renders them, quote, insignificant objects of desire. This is not only something done to women. No, she believes it is something that they were deeply complicit in too. This path, in Wollstonecraft's view, is a corruption, a degradation of what women ought to be. After all, she writes, women have human souls, and so, like men, are, quote, placed on this earth to unfold their faculties, to, quote, rise in excellence by the powers implanted in them for that purpose. Her great complaint, then, in the Rights of Women and other texts as well, is one that I think we can lodge in our time. A false system of education and other societal norms has not prepared women, or men for that matter, for their deeply noble human, social, spousal, and parental obligations. They were living, or we are living, lives more akin to animals than the dignified humans we are created to be. Wollstonecraft writes then to, quote, effect a revolution in female manners, to restore their lost dignity, so that by reforming themselves, they might reform the world. So for those who know the work of Edith Stein, we might say that Wollstonecraft wants women to resist what Stein calls the, quote, specific degeneracy of women, which Stein similarly describes as, quote, servile dependence on man, or people-pleasing, caring inordinately about what others think. And this leads to a predominantly, Stein says, sensual animal existence. Think of the description of women in Genesis after the fall. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. This feminine degeneracy of servile dependence is not good for women's souls, which I'll get to in a minute. But even before that, this degeneracy is also particularly dangerous to women in light of what Stein and Wollstonecraft too regards as a specific degeneracy in man. Brutal despotism over other creatures, especially women. The danger for women, according to Stein, is that, quote, instead of spiritualizing the body, the soul is controlled by it, and the body loses accordingly its character as a human body. Wollstonecraft sings the same tune, quote, taught from infancy that beauty is woman's scepter, the mind shapes itself to the body and seeks only to adorn its person. So whereas Rousseau, I think, wished for women to lean into and make use of their sensuality, both Wollstonecraft and Stein want by education to protect women from the characteristic vices to which they are tempted, because they want to call them to something greater. As Stein put it, quote, "It is sinful theft toward God to give oneself completely to another other than God." But it is not only dangerous for a woman to be utterly dependent upon a man who is or may become a monster. Women, like men, after all, are moral and accountable creatures who are made ultimately for eternity, for union with God. Quote, "The main business of our lives," Wollstonecraft writes, "is to learn to be virtuous." And continuing here, "And he who is training us for immortal bliss knows best what trials will contribute to make us so. And our resignation and improvement will render us more respectable to ourselves and to that being, capital B, whose approbation is of more value than life itself." She wrote to her sister that she especially liked this definition of virtue: "The doing good to mankind in obedience to the will of God and for the sake of everlasting happiness." And so here is how her view of education, and really the purpose of rights and government too, that I write about in my book, The Rights of Women, differs from Locke's and her other chief educational interlocutor, because he was Rousseau's too. For Locke, the end of government is liberty and the protection of rights. And so the purpose of education is preparation for the responsible use of liberty, preparation for life. A liberal society, according to Locke, requires both men and women to acquire all of the virtues. For girls to play outdoors and be rationally educated, especially so they can educate their own children, and for boys to acquire modesty too. Wollstonecraft agrees with Locke in this regard. Both men and women should work to acquire all of the virtues, even if some, like modesty and chastity, come more naturally to women, are harder for men, and others, like strength and courage and conflict, come more naturally to men. Wollstonecraft, like Stein, wished not to cancel out what's distinctively feminine or masculine in each, but to ensure against a one-sided development. We can see the difference between Locke and Wollstonecraft most plainly in their distinctive views of reason, which is the chief, but as we'll see, not the only human faculty developed through a good education. For Locke, reason is practical and calculating, and in service to a kind of comfortable self-preservation of oneself and one's family. For Wollstonecraft, by contrast, reason is, quote, "an emanation of divinity, the tie that connects the creature to the creator." Quote, "the heaven-lighted lamp that may safely be trusted when not entirely depended upon." The mind, then, is not a blank slate as it is for Locke, but rather consists of, quote, "innate principles for discerning truth," to which the mind is naturally inclined and by proper education is directed. And so contemplation of the divine is not only possible for Wollstonecraft, it is natural and really the highest end of reason. Education then is not mere preparation for life, as Locke would have it, but, as Wollstonecraft puts it, the first step to form a being advancing toward perfection. She writes, quote, "The discovery of his, capital H, wisdom and goodness improves our nature and renders us capable of enjoying a more godlike portion of happiness." And this is why she believes that women must be educated to see the whole, the real purposes of their lives in God, not only because it is where they will find their own happiness, but because it is the only way to help them to see how important their work is as mothers, as those preparing others for eternity too. They will not be strong, faithful, benevolent, maternal women that others need if they are turned in on themselves, superficially caring about appearances from their youth, consumed with how to please, instead of forging their characters and those of others in humble dependence upon God. But she also wants them to be intimate companions of their husbands, to win not only their love, but also their respect. Quote, By managing her family and practicing various virtues, she becomes the friend and not the humble dependent of her husband. This kind of marriage is, for Wollstonecraft, the sort that will enable the happiness of the spouses in the difficult work of raising children. Here is a description of a woman she imagines who has admirably forged her character in the way that Wollstonecraft has sort of laid out. She marries a good and just man for love, but he dies and she is left a widow. As the mom of many children, I especially love this passage. Quote, "I think I see her surrounded by her children, reaping the reward of her care. She lives to see the virtues which she endeavored to plant on principles fixed into habits, to see her children attain a strength of character sufficient to enable them to endure adversity without forgetting their mother's example. The task of life thus fulfilled, she calmly waits for the sleep of death, and rising from the grave may say, 'Beyond, thou gavest me a talent, and here are 5 talents.'" End quote. In that passage, I should note, she also is commending this woman because she doesn't want a woman who has lost her husband to start competing with her own daughters after another man, to be seeking for another man. She wants her focused on caring for her own children and doing the work of then both husband and father and mother. So we come at last to Wollstonecraft's view of a proper education for women. It forms the mind through its rigor, but it is also religious and moral. It is what we called liberal for a long time and might today called classical. In her view, we can't expect women to virtuously carry out the duties they have to their families unless they understand why they ought to be virtuous. They must be offered a more transcendent vision. She argues a woman must be given the kind of education that will, quote, "strengthen her reason till she comprehend her duty, to see in what manner it is connected to her real good. The more understanding women acquire," she continues, "the more they will be attached to their duty, comprehending it. For unless they comprehend it, unless their morals be fixed on the same immutable principles as those of man, no authority can make them discharge it in a virtuous manner." Her concern, then, is that without understanding how fulfilling her duties is connected to her happiness, women will neglect those duties for superficialities and, quote, "in their ignorance, intermeddle with more weighty affairs." In other words, if women aren't properly educated to fully understand how their part fits into the whole, they will not become the domestic rulers Rousseau hopes. They will instead, quote, "by their cunning tricks, ruin not only the Republican project, but their own marriages and children too." Or, as we see today in an educational landscape bereft of a transcendent vision and moral formation, they may begin to not even desire marriage or children at all. Wollstonecraft understands education then as a process of schooling the desires and cultivating the natural inclinations I spoke of at the outset toward the goal of full human flourishing. And the best education is offered through a process of imitation and habituation, always in recognition that the process of developing and refining one's reason is in union with God, who is the author of reason. Quote, "Other creatures," she writes, "only think of supporting themselves, but man is allowed to ennoble his nature by cultivating his mind and enlarging his heart." Obviously, man there is human. As she writes in the introduction of her female reader, which I'll tell you more about in a minute, quote, "Teach us with humble awe to imitate the divine patterns and lure us to the paths of virtue." Wollstonecraft writes well of our deep dependence upon others as we grow in virtue, but also of our own personal accountability to do so. Both are characteristic of our creatureliness. Quote, "We are all dependent on each other, and this dependence is wisely ordered by our Heavenly Father to call forth many virtues, to exercise the best affections of the human heart and fix them into habits. But we are also," quote, "created accountable creatures who must run the race ourselves and by our own exertions acquire virtue. The utmost our friends can do is point out the right road and clear away some of the loose rubbish which at first would retard our progress. And so women must not be educated like a, quote, fanciful kind of half-being, focused only on, as I've said now many times, external adornments, accomplishments, or charm. They must, quote, endeavor to acquire the human virtues or perfections of their nature, to become, and I borrow this phrasing from Abigail Favali, which I sort of said in the panel too, to become fully human, wholly woman, and uniquely individual. As Wollstonecraft writes in one of her early pedagogical books, echoing some of what Susan was discussing about education earlier, quote, whatever tends to impress habits of order on the expanding mind may be reckoned the most beneficial part of education. For by this means, the surest foundation of virtue is settled without struggle, and strong restraints knit together before vice has introduced confusion. And so in her Female Reader, which she compiles for the edification of young women, she collects together passages from Scripture, Shakespeare, and Milton, among many others, to, quote, gradually form girls' taste, so that they might, in the words of one Wollstonecraft scholar, learn not what to say, but rather how to read, think, and pray well, and how to exercise their reason, cultivate virtue, and refine devotional taste. Wollstonecraft says, study the noble models of antiquity till your imagination is inflamed, and then you may imitate without copying those great originals. Books, she writes, quote, are never failing friends, but, she warns, parents and teachers ought not give to children those books that, quote, give a wrong account of human passions when they are young, because it might kind of distort how they think. And all instruction in the arts, drama, and science, too, points back to the majesty of God. Whatever, quote, tends to make visible the wisdom of the supreme being in the world we inhabit is of the utmost importance to our happiness. And so, in Wollstonecraft's account, one learns to be virtuous through the gradual refinement of all our human faculties in a dynamic engagement of the imagination, understanding, judgment, and affections, especially through imitating the patterns we find in moral exemplars. One puts on righteousness not ultimately as a rule obeyed, a ritual practice, or a philosophical tenet held, even as obedience, rituals, and understanding are all essential components. Rather, in imitating exemplars from an early age in books like The Big House in the Little Woods, in our parents, in our teachers, hopefully if we have good ones, we develop the moral virtues that perfect our relation with God and with others, being crafted and crafting ourselves in turn. Schooling the moral imagination through imitation was the key to acquiring virtue for Wollstonecraft, but so was making virtue one's own. And it is this making virtue one's own that afforded women, quote, independence, the capacity of carrying out their obligations to others. Or as she puts it in a way that is entirely foreign to our modern ears, quote, the being who discharges the duties of its station is independent. Though Wollstonecraft is often somewhat anachronistically called the first feminist, her account of independence as the grand blessing of life, the basis of every virtue, is nearly the inverse of modern feminism's illusory quest for autonomy or freedom from all given obligations. Rather, independence is, she says, secured by contracting my wants and, as I mentioned before, carrying out my duties. The virtuous person then is independent and free because he or she is habituated in both doing and, even more importantly, loving the good that he or she does. So how can we measure our progress in virtue? Wollstonecraft was very clear. In our treatment of others, not only those for whom we have natural affections, though we must start there, but also those kind of lowlier than us in terms of status, social status. Quote, if I behave improperly to my servants, I am really their inferior. as I abuse a trust and imitate not the being whose servant I am without a shadow of equality. To echo what Susan said this morning, I find it particularly fascinating that and really sad actually, that just as we began to focus more in the West on the education and elevation of women, as Wollstonecraft in 1792 hoped we would, we also began to forget what true education actually was, viewing it as a purely technical, skills-building enterprise, or increasingly, it seems, a form of indoctrination for secular society, rather than, and importantly, an inescapably moral and religious one. If you think about it then, we actually haven't yet seen a society in which women are the political equals of men, but in which women and men are both really and truly educated, except in some religious enclaves like the University of Dallas. But this authentic elevation of women as women was what Wollstonecraft and those who followed her in the early women's movement were after, an effort that was abandoned with the triumph of technocratic education, the sexual revolution, and modern feminism. The chips are down, it seems to me, quite low down, but what a grand opportunity that organizations like ISI and schools like UD and many of the schools you all come from have to kind of lead the way, and parents are looking for this now, more and more parents. Before I conclude, I want to imagine Rousseau's retort to the kind of education I've laid out, inspired by Wollstonecraft's own vision. And in our post-Christian, highly secular society, I think some on the right see his retort as a powerful one. Hey, Bachiochi, hey, Wollstonecraft, most women aren't going to be convinced to give up their unjust feminine power and look to God for their noble dignity. And Christianity makes men weak and effeminate anyway. The only hope in our narcissistic age, he'd continue, I think, is reckoning honestly with the low human instinct to dominate and obey. And so the best case scenario in our secular state is to make women more dependent upon men, because then women in their relative weakness will figure out how to be men's true masters. His vision of this sweetness of family life, in Rousseau's words, is our best hope of forming better citizens. So I will first say that I do think that sensuality, sexual desire, erotic love does serve to inspire both men and women to better themselves if it is chaste and modest. There is an important way, though, in which it makes both men and women submissive to the opinions of those they want, those they desire, those they love. This is a very good thing and something we have lost, I think, due to the sexual revolution, the pillification and pornification of our sexual culture. But I also believe when our intellect, will, desires, and imagination are cultivated properly as children, that deep companionship in marriage and sharing in the goods of the family is more natural to us than Rousseau perceived. If we wish to see our civilization renewed, we aren't going to be able to rely entirely on law and politics. We'll need a moral revolution, and it starts by winning each day the battle raging in each of our own souls. Thank you.
All right, we do have time for a few questions, so go ahead and raise your hand, and I will come find you.
Hi. So I was wondering about so when Harry met Sally, it's like men and women can't be friends.
Yeah.
And so how we don't really have spaces that are just, single sex spaces anymore. And I was wondering if you think that kind of harms our ability to really appreciate the femininity of other women, because we kind of now only see it as competition.
So single-sex spaces for both women and men.
Yeah.
So I don't know that we would, I think you're right that there's a way in which women, this is one of the ways in which, women can be degraded, can degrade each other, is by this competition, right? And I would say, I was not raised in any religious tradition, so I was sort of playing on, I was like a Rousseauian girl, but like just literally sitting in high school, waiting, just sort of thinking about the boys around me and waiting like for the door so I could go and flirt, So I totally get it. And I think there is a way in which women in single-sex spaces and men in single-sex spaces can build each other up, unless they're not virtuous and they don't have virtuous leaders, right? And then there can be just like the way in which you see you see it in actually a lot of like feminist sort of circles where they literally just tear each other apart, and then there's like infighting and all of that. And then with men, there can be like, well, I don't know what you could say about all male spaces where there's not a virtuous leader, right? That can also get like way in the gutter and really, super disrespectful to men or to women and all that. So I can see this. So my boys and girls go to single-sex schools. And so you can see these kinds of temptations. The other thing that you see is, that I kind of mentioned in the panel is, a tendency, I think it's really true, one of the differences between men and women, which I think some people have mentioned, is that women sort of are oriented toward persons and men toward things. That sounds bad, like systematizing just sort of how things work and all that. And that's really cool, right? But you can also see how it can be degrading if it's if it's in sort of a vicious person. So if you're consumed with persons, then you're thinking about gossip and all those kinds of things can kind of take over, right? So that's all to say that there are dangers in single-sex spaces. However, there's also real beauty and potential in single-sex spaces, right? If you have people who are really oriented toward bringing sort of the best out of the sexes, right? And I think it's funny. So my friend Mary Harrington wrote the book Feminism Against Progress, and I really enjoyed the book, but I said to her on a panel actually at Heritage that there was one word I think that was missing. She has a title of one of the chapters called Let Men Be, and I said it should say Let Men Be Formed, because I don't think we want to let any of us be, right? We want to become something greater, who we're meant to be, and not just sort of. So yes, I think that that the goods of friendship in single-sex spaces are really, really important, but they have to be cultivated, or else we can sort of drag each other down.
Hi, I'm Alice. I'm from UD. And you talk a little bit about formation and reading books and how that can through your imagination, you can imitate certain exemplars through different forms of education. But what is your, and maybe we have the same opinion on this, of we don't just consume books, but we also consume media, songs,
right,
movies, etc., especially as we're growing up. At least for me, growing up in a very full of technology age, we're constantly having different exemplars thrown at us, and different celebrities or stuff like that. Even if we try not to, we can't help but look at them.
Mm-hmm.
So what is your opinion on that? And is it all just superficial? There's amazing ways that social media can be used to connect people, but at the same way, how can it distract us and make us rethink about fall into that superficiality as well?
Yeah. And I think that's the temptation, right, is the superficiality of all of us. We're all it's kind of skin deep, and we don't even know what we don't know about life or anything, which is really sad. That's part of kind of conversion, right? And then the conversions get deeper and deeper, and I didn't know it. Oh, wow, I know more. Yeah. And I still don't know what I don't know and all that. Yes, there's a great deforming process of all the images. So we talked about it last night with porn-saturated culture, and then I think Susan talked about it really beautifully. And the way she put it was that we need a cleansing. And I think that that's what I would say, is that in some ways we can't get fully away from it. We can make a decision, I am going to not look at porn, right? We can make a decision, and then we can humbly ask for the grace to be able to carry that out. But we are constantly bombarded by images anywhere we go, right? So we need a cleansing, and we also need other images. And I think that's really important. So it's not just children who need to not ever have those images enter as much as we can by filling them with great images. If you think about if you're educated in a family where those things are kept at bay as much as possible, and you have all of these incredible images, then there's a way in which when they see kind of the kind of images that are coming at them today, there's like a real repulsion. It's like a natural repulsion, and I think like that's a healthy thing. But what do you do when you weren't raised in a family and you saw all these images and all that? I mean, there is like, to my mind, I mean, that's why some of the most powerful sort of, healing from porn or whatever for both men and women, they tend to be religious conversions because they like need the power of full-on grace to be able to like heal from all that. But then it is like a slow process of healing, cleansing, and finding new images. So keeping those other at bay, but we are like imaginative creatures, like our images are always going. So whether it's watching old movies or reading, the lives of the saints, or spending time going to beautiful places, spending time in nature. I mean, I think that we do have to recognize how much we need to provide alternatives to ourselves, and can't just sort of say like no, bad stuff, but like we have to feed that part of us with real beauty. It's so quiet.
Hi again. So thank you for the talk. It was just as good as I thought it was going to be. I'm curious a little bit about your background. I know you have a JD, like you're a lawyer. How does that translate over to your interest in gender and sex? I'm just really curious to know how you bridge those two things, because I'm in the same boat, frankly.
Yeah. Okay. So how does that interest? So my background, so you heard some about my family background earlier, but when I was at Middlebury, I was a sociology women's studies student. And then I had this kind of intellectual conversion. Well, first kind of a moral conversion, because I started going to AA when I was 17, but then like an intellectual conversion, religious conversion. And all that like sent me into political theory. So I studied political theory for the last 2 years. And then I went off and did theology and more political theory. And then I went to law school. So I actually thought like women's studies, put that to bed. Like, I'm not interested in that anymore. But I mean, as things, as you cease, part of it was, as I think Susan mentioned, reading John Paul II's sort of corpus of work on women was very attractive to me. And really like I fell in love with the Catholic Church through reading those, Mulieris Dignitatem and then his letter to women. I just thought like he was a kindred spirit, right? And really, so I was really healed by a lot of that. And then I think the interest just became, when I was in law school, I was trying to decide like what I'm going to do. I got married and had a child my final year in law school. Wouldn't recommend that, but she's great. Got to graduate from Notre Dame. And so I was really interested in religious liberty. I was interested in schools and school choice, questions like that. And then an opportunity was brought to me to work on the abortion question. And I had a pretty significant change of heart on that issue. And so I was asked to edit this volume that became my first book, The Cost of Choice. And so that kind of got me in that space and then thinking more about kind of women and gender questions, and then have been really kind of since. Yeah. Yeah. And so I should say, because this may not be something any of you know, so I just recently wrote a book called The Rights of Women, Reclaiming a Lost Vision, which kind of rereads. So we have like the winners write the history. And so we have, as you mentioned, like a kind of corpus of like what women's history is that was written by particular people with particular agendas, right? And so it's sort of rereading those early texts and trying to give a very different account and sort of revealing both the natural law and religious foundations of a lot of that early work, and then showing like the disjuncture that happens with the pill, with Margaret Sanger and abortion and all that.
Hello, I'm William Saylor. I'm from the University of Dallas. And so I was wondering, how do you square the her Wollstonecraft's emphasis on independence in the relationship with the the Catholic view, like mutual submission and the very fact of complementarity, which doesn't it basically imply that the fulfillment of each requires the other, including like the moral fulfillment, like the way a lot of times like a man or woman is brought to moral maturity is through their like great admiration for their spouse or their beloved. Like, isn't that kind of, on the whole, a very good thing?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, one of the things I mentioned in the earlier panel is that she talks about loving one another on account of their virtues. And the way I'll restate how she defines independence is the person who carries out the duties of the station is independent. So she's putting together this idea of kind of acquiring virtue and the need for one is virtuous, one is both doing and loving the good. Like, that's to be truly virtuous. This is not just like doing my duty and, having to do it. And I mean, that's the beginning of virtue, is actually doing your duty, right? Doing the obligation that you have, but it's really loving that obligation. And so she sees that as independence because you're free in some sense in order to do what is right? And that's the Christian account of liberty, right, is doing what is right. Or being free to do what is right. So how do they come together? Well, it's like she talks about how, men and women have different duties, but they ought to carry them out with the same principles or the same virtues. And so the embodied nature of men and women obviously requires them, especially in motherhood and fatherhood, which she talks all about, is that they have these different duties to the family and to one another. And so it brings them together. So like in virtuously carrying out their duties, they are coming together, right? Does that make sense? And so there's not an independence from each other. It's an independence in order to do the duties. So it's like entirely like flipping how we understand independence on its head, which is hard, but you have to, read texts and carefully and try to understand them without like putting our modern conception back on it. And I appreciate that you said mutual submission, because that is a very beautiful part of the both scripture and the teaching of the church.
Hi, I'm Beatrice. I also go to UD. As a lover of fiction and reading novels, I try to be more aware of the types of things that people are reading these days, especially young women. And as a result of that, I just tend to be I find a lot of the books that young people are reading, especially young women today, just to be really annoying and just bad literature. But for some reason, they're just very trendy and very popular. And I firmly believe that the types of fiction that you consume, whether it's in book form or film, has a lot to do with your moral formation and a lot to do with your character. So how do you think we should respond to the types of super trendy, especially like really trashy romance novels that are for some reason really popular? How do you think that we should respond to that? And how do you think that affects the moral formation of women?
Yeah. I mean, she argued against that too in the last chapters of The Rights of Women, but then also in her earlier work, is those kind of romance novels that inflate. Yeah. So ban them? I don't know. No, I'm kidding. I mean, some should be banned for sure. I mean, the fact that, and this is something parents really have to pay attention to. Like, one of the reasons that I, am fully in the workplace now, working way more than I would like to be, is because I have 7 children. I'm sending them all to Catholic schools. I mean, mainly Hillsdale, as well. But so it's, as parents, like, you have to really take care with what your children are reading. And so a lot of that is finding these schools that read really old and good things that have withstood the test of time. I mean, I want to give, I don't know, I don't think, actually, there is someone who knows Anna here. I'm just going to give my daughter a shout out, because Anna, so she's a philosophy student at Notre Dame, and she's really quite brilliant, I think. But she is sort of, in some ways, I learned about this from her, because I'm not a reader of fiction. I'm hoping that I'll progress to become a reader of fiction as I grow in wisdom. But right now, I just really like philosophy. So someday as I get older. So she, though, from a very young age, she just loved like all the classics and would just eat them up like one after another after another. And she's still, I mean, she's like, Mom, I gotta, the Kindle's now charging me $1. Can I get, and it's like everything I hear that she's reading, it's another one and another one, another one. And what's so beautiful is one time all the other kids were sleeping and she was probably like 12. You're gonna have to go home and go back to Notre Dame. There's a friend of Anna's here, tell her the story. But so she's the only one awake. We're in the car and my husband and I are, my husband's driving and we're going wherever home. And so we're just chatting with her about these books that she reads. She loves Pride and Prejudice, of course. So she had kind of in her own mind, she's pretty introverted, had like put together like the qualities of a man that she admired, not through one man, like not just Darcy, but like all these different people in her mind who had become like, Rousseau's illusion of like this other. But what was beautiful is it really enabled her, like she had these characters that were her friends. They were her friends in her mind who she could kind of spend time with. They were actually, Wollstonecraft talks about good books being real friends, right? And I think that's I think that's hard because these books are often very hard to get into. And so they have to be, brought back. But I think that kind of, those sorts of friends can be really helpful for a person's imagination, as I was saying. So what do you do about the people who are reading these books? I mean, it's hard to say, here, read Pride and Prejudice. But maybe you should just say, here, read Pride and Prejudice. I mean, or like have book groups where people can read these more together, invite your friends into these to just help them see the quality of the characters and the quality of the writing is so much better. I mean, I do think we just live in a really, a time where, I don't know, it's just like titillation is more interesting. And so it's a real time of civilization decline. So we have to be like the remnant, right, who keeps this stuff alive and then, well, have a lot of children and teach them all.
Hi, I'm Kim Burns. I teach politics here at UD.
She teaches Rousseau, so here it comes.
But I don't have a question about Rousseau,
Oh.
actually. I very much appreciate your talk, and it was very lovely, and thank you so much. I do have a question about calling Wollstonecraft's conception of virtue classical and Christian. With the exception of the City and Speech and Plato's Republic, I can't think of that many examples of early Christian and classical authors requiring the sort of independence of women for the sake of their development of virtue. In fact, a lot of the classical and early Christian authors accepted a more patriarchal understanding of society and family. So I was wondering what accounts for Wollstonecraft's difference from them in that respect?
So in other words, the early Christians wouldn't have thought that women were capable of what she's saying is, I mean, so one of the quotes I had of her talking about obedience to the will of God and preparing for eternal life. I mean, that seems to be something that Christians, I mean, Augustine fully expected women to be capable of, or to be submit to. So I guess, can you say more about? Yeah, sorry, you took that. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, yes, you're right, that she is, I think, an advance in the thought of Christian understanding of women's capacity for virtue. I mean, I think that's like the point of why we read her, is that she understands women as not just ornamental or, those who reproduce for us or those who care for the household. I mean, I think, in some ways, like Aristotle doesn't understand women as capable of public or political virtue, right? But is very much capable of kind of the virtues necessary for the household, but not the kind of, not the kind of virtues as necessary outside the household. I mean, I don't know if that's the best way of putting it. But so, yeah, I mean, I see her as an advance. I mean, part of the reason I really love Wollstonecraft and have learned so much from her is that I love the ancients and I love Thomas Aquinas and I love Augustine, but they don't seem to do justice to the capacities of women. And so I don't want to, finding her is exciting for me because I don't want to be a person who just sort of says, like, I'm okay with, I don't want to throw out Christianity because I disagree with some of the ways in which women were perceived in early Christianity, right? And so to me, it's like, in order to, sort of have like a feminist take on all of it or something, or modern feminist take. So it seems to me that she's capable of like looking at the tradition and saying, yeah, and women too. And not that there's not differences, right? But that there's a capacity, because we're fully human, that there's a capacity and expectation of becoming as virtuous as we can. I mean, obviously we all fall, and partly of that is like humility was what she thought to be the queen of the virtues anyway.
Hi, my name's Porter Schmidt. I'm also a student here at the University of Dallas. My question is, based on Wollstonecraft's writings, or maybe just even your own analysis of them, what the role of the church, and specifically celibate men, the priest, is in the education of women, because a lot of men my age, myself included, it's possible the seminary is the call after college, and how do we prepare if we as men are in the place of forming not just other men but women too?
Yeah. So this is a really interesting question, because Wollstonecraft, again, when she's writing against, we shouldn't say against Burke, because there's things she learns a lot from Burke, but in her first vindication, which is the Vindication of the Rights of Man, she's very hard on clerics. And she's hard on clerics because she thinks that they have become corrupt through basically being paid large sums by the elites and the aristocratic society. And so they're not able to chastise or challenge these men who have paid their living, because they're beholden to them in terms of and so there's a lot, you could just say, oh, she's anti-Catholic. I don't think that's right. I think she does have problems with the Eucharist. I mean, there's other things, but with the clerics, she's challenging them the way that I would want to challenge some clerics too, not on that, but on some other things, right? So they're not really cultivating virtue in the people they should be cultivating virtue in, right? And so it's people go in and out of Mass, or for her it was, Anglican, which she was raised in the Anglican tradition, and they're not improving their character. They're just saying I went and now I'm gonna go and read horoscopes as one of her things. It's not called horoscopes, it's something, anyway, she says, aren't you Christian women? You just came out of church and now you're reading whatever horoscopes or whatever they're called. It's not horoscopes, whatever it was. So I think she definitely saw a role for, one of the people who was most formative in her life was Richard Price, who was a Unitarian minister back when the Unitarians actually believed something, who was actually a great friend, you can read about this in my book, but of many of the founders. And he was, I think Abigail Adams said he had a charity that was beyond all of men. I don't know, anyway, because Abigail and John Adams were actually parishioners, if that's the right word for in the congregation, around the time when Wollstonecraft was too. Abigail Adams, by the way, called herself Wollstonecraft's pupil, or Adam. Anyway, so they must have known each other somewhat. So she had this great regard for this preacher, right? So she certainly learned kind of at his feet. So that is all to say her part. In terms of what I understand, I have a deep affection as a Catholic for the Catholic priesthood, and hope that one of my sons will become a priest. Deeply hope that one of my sons will become a priest. I have the one in mind. But anyway, I think that we were talking about single-sex spaces and the formation that young boys can have, so my boys all are altar servers with really incredible men. And and it's just that kind of formation that is preparation for a male-only role, I think, is a really beautiful, beautiful thing. In my book, another collection, Women, Sex, and the Church, A Case for Catholic Teaching, there's a chapter on the all-male priesthood and why it's not sexist by Sister Sarah Butler. I think that there's a great deal. First of all, in administrating the sacraments, of course, right? Because that's sanctity is the route to any of this, to good marriages and to motherhood and all that. I don't know if there's anything more to say than yes, you will be able to forming, and I think giving counsel. The work in confessionals and things like that is all men. It's a male role, and of course, women, Catholic women, and hopefully more who come into the church need that deeply, right, to become the saints they're called to be. So.
Hi, my name is Martin Ellison, student at the University of Dallas. What do you think men and women stand to learn the most from one another in a romantic relationship? And what do they stand to learn from one another if they're not engaged romantically?
So if they're friends.
Like if they're
friends.
Just like friends. Yes. Assuming that some level of friendship could philosophically be applied. I'm not posing whether it could be, but
Yeah.
I leave it to the.
I definitely think that husbands and wives can be friends in the Aristotelian sense. I don't know about. I mean, I have many male friends. Do I consider them like friends the way I consider like my deepest female friends? No, not really. But I don't know if it's because it's impossible. I don't really have an opinion on that. Really, I haven't thought too much about it. So, what can men and women learn from one another? This is definitely the hardest question I've had in a while, because to me, there's obviously great differences between men and women, but then there's so many distinctive characteristics of each man and woman that it's hard to like whittle down. Like I can tell you about what I learned from my husband and maybe what my husband maybe learns from me, but that seems to be not particularly adequate since we're kind of distinctive sorts of men and women. I mean, like on those charts, like he's more agreeable than I am and I'm more disagreeable, or those charts that say like women are more agreeable than men. I don't know if you know what I'm referring to. Yeah. What can women learn from men? I'll tell you, I'll just give sort of personal. I think that there's a way that the good men that I know, namely my husband, there's a straightforwardness and like a cutting through a lot of crap that is a real sort of assistance to. I'm not saying like men can get very impassioned too, right? But there's a way in which a good man can kind of just calm things. And I think that that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And so what can men learn from women? What John Paul II would say is attention to the person, right? And so there's a way in which, as Camille Paglia rightly says, like if there were no men, we'd all be living in grass huts, which I think is great. Like there's a way in which like men throughout time, and I think not just in the past, but also now tend to be the ones who are building and creating and up on bridges and doing all these not only dangerous work, but, systematizing kind of work. And so I think there's a way in which at least John Paul would say that is all really good and important work, but that we need to make sure that it's like for the sake of the human being and for the sake of the human being in line with his or her transcendent purpose. So I guess, but again, those are like really great men and really great women who are going to teach that to each other. I don't know about, vicious men and women. I don't really want to know what they teach each other. I hope that was at least, I'm not sure if that was at all a good answer, but that was my attempt.
Hello, my name is Catherine Dixon, and I go to Dallas Baptist University. And I just kind of have a question about, you mentioned classical education, and I was raised outside of classical education, but I have a lot of friends that were raised in Catholic classical education thing. It's just, how do you reconcile being in like a classical education and being kind of like in that kind of environment and reconciling with like non-believers and being able to like relate to them, or people that live in a secular world? Like, how do you reconcile those two?
Yeah. So, obviously I think the best classical education is going to be in a religious context, and in my view would be in a Catholic context. But I think that so what is classical education but really trying to orient students to the transcendentals, right? The good, the true, and the beautiful. And I just think that that's something that everybody is longing for, even if they don't know it yet. And so part of it is trying to help them, sort of inspiring those others to see, like, don't you think that there are things that are more beautiful than not? Now, some people tell you no, like they're complete relativists, right? But I think that if you at least get in a conversation that's a long conversation, you can help them, guide them to see. And I think have those kinds of conversations are like we're all aiming. I mean, clamoring for justice is making claims about the good, right? Scientific study is making claims about the true. So I think that that's an important kind of apostolic work, is like using those kinds of, like, just being classically educated. And I am not by when I was a kid or something, but I've tried to catch up as best I can, is just a sense of like knowing that these sorts of demands on us are natural to us as human beings. The demands for justice, the demands, to be courageous and to be ashamed when we're not. Like, those kinds of things are just built in, and we have to be really deformed, I think, to like really crush them. And so most people, I mean, if you are around a 2-year-old for very long, like, there's a natural desire for justice, right? Inclination to justice. So a lot of that is just helping, I think, bring people along to see, and I think it's doing it in like a non-ideological way, but in a really like Socratic way, right? Like, help just having a conversation together. Because what we have to remember, I mean, this I know from having been like deeply on the other side, is like, we're trying to bring people, like, we want converts, not to crush people, right? Like, there are people who just don't know what they don't know. And so it's really, obviously, if people are doing harm, then we need to deal with that. But for a lot of people, they're just like, there's no sense of anything that we've been given. And so it's like a gratitude about the gifts that we have and all that we've been given, and then going out to help the others, and also learning from the others. Because each human being, I mean, has a spark of God, right? They're alive, then they're being like willed into existence, loved into existence by God. And so how can we learn from them too? And I do a lot of, I mean, because of all my work on the pro-life issue, I have a lot of conversations with pretty high-level pro-choice academics. And a lot of this has been through a mutual regard, just because we're human beings who try to have affection for one another. And that's brought us a long way. And I would just really commend that. I think it's a much better way, even if we don't push each other too far, but there's something that comes by that kind of regard for someone who has such distinct views of the world, right?
All right, folks, that wraps up our questions. Let's have a round of applause for Erika.